Welcome, everybody. Thank you again for having us. Welcome again to all of you out there joining us from our last presentation. And for those who couldn't make it last time, I do believe the recording will be available. There will be plenty of material here to get you caught up. Again, the intention is to go into more depth from before. So we are continuing with our topic. Last time we tried to provide just our story concretely about what we did, to have that in mind as a framework. And our intention today is to go through into greater depth on the various issues and the conclusions we found and the way we're trying to turn those into principles and best practices. So as we say here on our slide, we're trying to arrange this in terms of a life cycle, how one would kind of construct a program from the beginning and follow it through more or less chronologically, just as a framing device. Okay, recruitment. How does one find those with intellectual disability to get them into the door? This is a significant first step. It would be a fantasy to imagine they'll just walk in the door and then have you there waiting for them. That just doesn't happen. In a lot of cases, there's a fear and an anxiety and just a lack of knowledge of what to do or even that it's available to them. So how one recruits is a significant issue to start with. We had it easy in that both of our institutions, the University of California, Davis and Florida Atlantic University, already have PSEs. These are post-secondary education programs, which provide a college experience for those with intellectual disability. So they're not degree granting, but they are kind of an integrated program mixing vocational training, college experience, elective classes, and so on to give a college experience. So this is kind of a new type of education that Leah talked about last time that is developing. So we just wanted to give you some numbers on the extent of this to give you a sense of how available this is. So in 2018, when we were working on our book, we got data from the Think College Institute, which is kind of a national clearinghouse on programs of this type. And their data said that there were 165 four-year programs and 95 two-year programs. Again, with a very odd distribution that we showed last time, heavily concentrated in the Northeast, somewhat in the Southeast, and surprisingly little on the West Coast in California. So this added up to maybe 265 or whatever. That total number has grown with our last check that we did as recently as the fall to a total of 300. But the composition is different in that the 4 years have shrunk down to maybe 40 of the total. And the rest are distributed between 2 year, 3 year, and then what they call variable, where it's kind of up to the student. So just an interesting pattern to be aware of. There are more of these programs out there, but even within the last 3 or 4 years, they are altering and changing as the field develops. So that is the status of PSEs now. Okay, the natural question is, well, how are libraries involving themselves on campuses where we have those PSEs, where the recruitment hurdle has been overcome? So that's a natural question. And actually, Lee and I are in the process of surveying this kind of activity now with a study. And our next point about the TPCI, this is a little teaser about some results we have. So we're actually going to kick that back to later when we'll talk about the new research in more depth. But this is just our placeholder to say, yeah, the PSEs are out there. If they're in your area, at your campus, or even the vicinity, that's a great resource, and it is growing. So if they're not there now, hopefully you can look for them in future. So that's something that applies at the college level. Okay, for the earlier grade levels, we drew a lot of our ideas from the experience with public libraries, who we surveyed for our book. And what we got from them kind of in distilled form is adult daycares. And I can even speak to this. My mother has advanced Parkinson's and is in a memory care facility. And I've been learning all about that kind of business and caring for her. And her institution actually has different divisions, one of which is a daycare. So people come and go while living in the community. So this is exactly the sort of thing that's out there. So this was a common source. Other kinds of community organizations, and I don't have real specifics, but really once you get into the special education community in your area, generally they have connections of other kinds of communities. So just connecting with the adult daycare is one way to find out about all these other kinds of organizations. Children's librarianship is another resource where one can identify those with intellectual disability earlier on. And actually, we'll talk later about a case study where this is probably the oldest program for libraries and those with intellectual disability that actually began as something that split off from a program in children's librarianship. So the people there who you might find may be appropriate, or even some of their methodology may be appropriate in using for those adults with intellectual disability. Another point is not just about the peer recruitment of individuals, but how it's important to engage the whole support of the community. So this can be done for whatever program that's in place by arranging for guest speakers from outside. So again, we'll talk more about this later in terms of a case study, but there was a lot of resourcefulness in having speakers from beauty pageants and just all kinds of interesting roles that the members would find interesting. Also, fundraising among the community can be another useful resource to deal with the ongoing costs. So these are all kinds of resources for public libraries. Now, for school libraries, they can take advantage of the fact that students with ID have been largely mainstreamed due to national legislation for some time. So the students are already in the schools and they are in proximity, and a school library can just have a lookout for those students in this case and maybe design programs for them. So in a sense, the recruitment is already there in the sense that the individuals are on site. So it's really a matter of identifying them and finding appropriate programming for them. Okay, so those are our thoughts on recruitment. Just another, just a short comment. I think it might be worth knowing for those who haven't dealt a lot with those with intellectual disability of the kinds of behaviors and personalities you encounter. And Lee and I have learned a lot about this, both coming really from the outside, even from just a few years ago. In practice, most of the students we've dealt with have Down syndrome. So they do have the cognitive difficulty and understanding and the other traits we talked about, the communication and socialization difficulty. But what surprised us is also a general very friendly and pleasant disposition, which is not the sort of thing you would expect from people who are disadvantaged. You might expect, well, difficulty and frustration, so on. But just very ironically, as part of their whole condition, they're very, very generous and friendly and supportive of others, which is a pleasant surprise. And this is not just a private opinion. This has been documented in the literature. There's something about this condition that makes them very, very easy to work with. Now, for those who don't have Down syndrome, but they do have the intellectual disability, that isn't always true. So just in my experience with our cohorts of students here at the University of California, Davis, it's those without the Down syndrome, but the cognitive difficulty who tend to get frustrated and angry and pose a little bit more of a problem. Outside that, we do get some individuals who have autism. So I believe Leah had one individual in particular, the kind of person who could tell when your birthday would fall in 30,000 years, this kind of thing. So a different case in autistic. This person fit in well, but I know autistic people do have socialization problems as part of their conditions. And my brother is actually a teacher of high school who has those with autism mainstreamed in his class. And he said they have had some behavioral problems with just inappropriate behaviors that require intervention continuously. So this is the kind of composition of students you're likely to deal with. And I'll say just as a final point on this, while our attitude is to be open and diverse and tolerant, it's not really our burden to deal with extreme behavioral problems. And I'm getting this just from the philosophy of our own PSC program here, where they said, they tell the students as part of being introduced to society and interactions, they also have their responsibilities to be keep up standards and not be rude and to be diligent and so on. So if there are real behavioral problems, they address that with the students. So if there's something like that comes up, I do not think, and this is obviously a point of discussion, but it's not our function to deal with something that's really extreme. And there are some individuals who just may not be suitable for the programming. That's something to keep in mind for the future. But on balance, Lee and I have been very, very pleasantly surprised that the bulk of the Down syndrome were just extraordinarily easy to work with. And really the other ones too, and it's been a very rewarding experience. So just a word, again, not only just on the recruitment, but the kind of personalities and behavior that you'll be dealing with.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the theory of how one selects books for those who have intellectual disabilities. And one obvious theory is that the children's literature would be a natural fit, given that those who have ID tend to have slower rates of learning. The next theory that we touched upon is in our previous presentation is high-low, which gains traction because those with ID are adults, and especially once they age out of high school, they have adult concerns. And the beauty of high-low is that they incorporate more mature themes with lower vocab so that it's easier for those with ID to understand. This genre was actually developed by a government program in the UK, and they do address certain mature issues such as homelessness, domestic violence, sexuality, drug abuse. A third approach is to use a multi-sensory literature, and an individual by the name of Nicola Grove. She had a background in teaching English, and then she transferred into special ed. She was very distraught by how little the selections were available to those who have ID. And she really wanted to give the readers exposure to classical works, literature such as Charles Dickens, Shakespeare, other classical works. So she takes a multi-sensory approach, and she uses excerpts from these classical works, and then she'll dramatize them. So the members actually will act out the excerpts that they read, and they use all of their senses to engage. And this actually proves to be a pretty successful approach. And on this slide, we're going to discuss the mixed results that we had when testing out these various theories. There really is no one theory that can explain everything. Some of the more successful books that I found that my members enjoyed were, of course, Dr. Seuss, the Disney Junior novelizations that I talked about in the last presentation, and adventure books. Some examples of unsuccessful books that the students really didn't enjoy would be picture books, poetry, and even some of the high-low books that focused on adolescent love were not as popular with the students. Another thing that we tried was to incorporate current events and news into our weekly discussions. And these current events would be categorized as high-low, and they did prove to be pretty successful. The students tend to like hard facts, but not necessarily fantasy. So one other thing that I did incorporate that students truly enjoyed was a biography of J.K. Rowling. I believe that's how you say her name, the lady who wrote the Harry Potter's series. And that was very well received. And then finally, just most recently, we've transitioned into, we are now called the Nosy Newsy Owls. And we meet on a weekly basis and we discuss current events. And the students love it. And they get to pick the current event that we discuss for the week. So ultimately, the most successful way to let the students participate is to choose their own book, what it is they would like to read. So I ask for input from the students. They volunteer titles. Perhaps they volunteer titles of books that they know have been based on certain movies that they like or Disney characters that they like. And then we take a vote, and the title that receives the most votes obviously wins. And that's what we're going to read for the semester. The successful stories tend to have rising action and a final climax. And the content tends to be concrete and action-based. But sometimes it's really not about the content at all, but really more about how the students relate to the storyline or the plot. And a really good example of this is when we read the R.L. Stine Goosebumps series. We chose a book called The Mummy's Curse. I believe it was The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb. And one of my members who was an emerging reader, she had very little word recognition and she tended to be quite shy and didn't really participate in the reading. She kind of came to life, and it come to find out she was from Egypt and would travel back home to Egypt with her family often to visit friends and relatives. And she just came to life as we read this book. She actually brought out her phone and was sharing photographs of her latest vacation home. She started to talk about the culture, the cuisine, the celebrations, and it was just really nice to see her engage and be able to contribute when she really hadn't done so before.
So just to finish out some thoughts on book selection before going into our next topic here. So it's not just about the book, as indicated in the last example with our student Marina. It's sort of the context. So context is kind of an introduction to instruction, how it's taught. But on the subject of book collection, we haven't really focused on this, but in most theories about collection for those with intellectual disability, it's also useful to collect books for guardians and those who are not intellectually disabled themselves, but have to do with their caretaking. So things to do with education and care and resources and so on. So that's generally considered an important supplement to collecting for those with intellectual disability, in addition to the direct reading matter for the individuals. Okay, so to continue our life cycle model, so we've got recruitment, the collection, now the instructional theory, like what does one do with these books? How do we set up a presentation scheme to get the most out of them? So here we're going to briefly cover some instructional theory that we found in the literature that turned out to be useful in our practice. So the first is universal design for learning, which is featured pretty consistently in a number of ALA programs that we've looked at. So this shouldn't really be completely new, but it is broadened out and is already familiar to the library community. Just to go over the high points, this is a theory that was developed in 1984 by educators at Harvard. The Harvard Education Department, and their idea is that learning, which is to say achievement, is context dependent. Okay, so it's not a matter of how much bulk knowledge you have or what kind of facility you display. A lot of it depends on how it's being measured in the context. So there's an example from the originators, Dr. David Rose, himself writing about this. He said, well, Dr. Rose is actually a very mediocre singer with very ordinary pitch control and perception. His wife is actually really quite skilled, quite a skilled singer. They both work in their church choir, and during practice, it is the wife who shines with her perfect pitch and her singing skills, and Dr. David is kind of clunking along, barely keeping in time. But during the big event, the actual worship service, it turns out that the varying skills of the whole congregation operate to distract Dr. Rose's wife, whose skills are they're oversensitive. She's thrown off by this and she has some difficulty, whereas Dr. Rose just kind of soldiers through with the basic time and he's keeping everyone going, which is the function of the choir in the first place. So he said, there from their own experiences, an example of achievement or learning is being context dependent. It's not really the skill, it's the situation that they're in. Okay, another example, since we're not so far removed from Christmas, I was thinking is the classic story of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. So what Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer illustrates is the multiple learning style. So the idea that people have different ways of accessing information. This is part of the kind of context. So they may thrive in certain kinds of learning styles, learning situations and not others. So I think we're probably familiar with the terminology. So visual learners like visual input and graphics and demonstration, audio learners like to hear and reflect, certain kind of tactical learners like sort of practical exercises and so on. So the idea is that each of these learning styles is a specific context that must be provided for the student to learn properly. Okay, this has led into a related concept of group learning. Okay, so students learn as a group rather than taking information from one source of authority like the teacher. They actually learn among themselves, incorporating different kinds of learning styles, and discussion-based is a corollary of this. In some extreme forms of this, or even having students lead or teach and actually all be context for each other. So the idea is that in this format, individual learning styles will interlock and complement each other. Okay, so this is how the theory is kind of translating into a practice. Okay, so those are the outlines of the theory. How does it measure up according to research? Well, there are mixed results. First of all, the assumption about learning styles is under serious question. So one particularly memorable study says, well, the study subjects all claim they had a particular kind of learning style, say visual learning, but in practice on a performance measure, they didn't even use that style, they used something else. So there's a question of, well, how do we know if someone's learning style is what they say it is or how much they actually use it? Typically, the behavior is not exclusive to one or the other, but there's always kind of a mixture of styles for all individuals. A second point of concern is that the whole term of UDL is used loosely. Necessarily so, since the theory is about appealing to different kinds of people and taking different forms. Well, if that's the fact, then it's very hard to measure, exactly what is consistently working from one situation to the next. So there's a kind of vagueness of terms that's undercutting any serious evaluation so far. Okay, so just distilling the conclusions from research as well as our own experience. It is a logical impossibility to be all things to all people. So if everyone did have a very distinctive learning style, any one method is going to maybe appeal to one at best and rule out everyone's else. So it's kind of a losing proposition. What we found is that to make this work, it's necessary to have a common framework. Okay, so you cannot have just everyone discussing on their own and doing their own thing. There needs to be some kind of framework which will register individual contributions as individuals and show how it contributes to the whole. Okay, what kind of framework this is context dependent. We go into some detail in our book, but one example is the multisensory literature example that we just talked about, where the framework is drama. Okay, so everyone will have their particular role as King Lear or Cornwall or Gloucester or these other characters in the play, but in expressing the individuality of that character, they're kind of netted together into this drama where everything makes sense and each person's role is valued. So the multisensory literature is one example of a common framework where individuals can express themselves and their individuality and so on, but it's all kind of processed together in a common framework. Okay, so those are highlights of UDL as we understood it and applied it to our work. Another one that is interesting to us is pre-literacy. Okay, this is the work of Lev Vygotsky, a Russian theorist from the early 20th century, and we'll have more to say about him later. But he addressed a very interesting and central question of how do people learn how to read, which is central to our question of those with intellectual disability, as well as to our whole tradition of children's librarianship, where we're trying to provide a support for people who are learning how to read. The answer, in short, according to this theory, is that it's a mystery. Okay, no one really knows how people learn how to read. Okay, this is to come out strongly against the popular assumption that it's sequential. So you keep breaking language down to its smallest components, syllables, letters, sounds, and then you start assembling those in reverse order: the sound, the letter, the syllable, then you get a word, then you get a phrase, and you combine them into sentences, and then it all builds up in a linear fashion. Okay, this is not what happens. Okay, that's sort of the way the educational system is organized, but what pre-literacy says is that all the important work is actually done at an earlier phase, and it consists of kind of a total sensory immersion of young children among adults in advanced discourses, where they're kind of listening and absorbing these things and not necessarily comprehending them at a conscious level, but they're kind of filling in and being processed somehow so that when they actually get to formal instruction, the ground has already been laid. Okay, so this is, a major theory in its own right, but we thought that it crossed over interestingly with UDL in combining the ideas of a multi-sensory approach and different kinds of flexible formats. Okay, so it was another kind of source for what we did.
So there is a distinction to make in the types of library use for those with intellectual disabilities. And while the Next Chapter Book Club was successful in bringing this group in, it represents an extension of the library space outward. It's worth noting that originally the Next Chapter Book Club excluded those with ID due to their strict no noise policy. Now this has since changed. The book clubs have been very successful in getting those with ID into the facility, and they have shown the potential that those with ID have in relating and engaging with the text, as well as what the skills the librarians possess in assisting those with ID. But the book club does not engage with the library's other resources and major services such as instruction and reference. And this is the next necessary step in order to deploy its full resources and to realize this goal of community integration. And the two main activities that I incorporate into my book club, of course, include reading and socialization. Both are considered to be outside the scope of what those with ID are capable of doing. And as it turns out, one of the activities actually stimulates the other. So we spoke before about the reading and the free-form discussion that sort of evolved over the years. Now we're going to discuss the games that are played and which ones are successful. So I found that quiz games work really well, especially if they have anything to do with Disney trivia. The students seem to really enjoy answering questions. Charades and Pictionary are also quite popular and include elements of performance. And I also incorporated a hybrid of games where the students could pull a card and they had the option to either verbally describe the clue, act out the clue, or draw it. And the students really seem to like this cooperative games, which includes another point of universal design for learning. So that certain games that were not as popular with the students would include things like bingo. And I think mostly that this one was not as fun for the students is because it was more played in isolation. The students really weren't interacting with their peers as they filled out their cards, as you can see here on this slide.
Okay, so that those are the book club activities, which after 7 years are pretty finely honed, as a matter of fact. Although there's always room for discovery, but that's well done. Now, the issue that I'm trying to work with on my end with my PSE program is what Leah mentioned before, this other arm of trying to incorporate those with ID into the kind of more traditional library activities. So we're kind of building this from the ground up. You sort of touched on this last time, but just to enlarge, our first step was pretty obvious and simple. It was a physical walking tour of the building and then a brief demo of the website. Okay, so that was fairly passive, what we do with the rest of our students here at UC Davis. So that went fine. It was pretty straightforward. The next step in our project was actually to give instruction on searching for books. Okay, so we were thinking about how to do that, and we were mindful again of our research that showed earlier that just dropping kind of a traditional instruction format on those with ID tends not to work. Like after your specialized sessions with funding and whatnot, no one ever comes back. It just never takes. So we wanted to do this in a way that would have more of appeal, and we were thinking about how to do this here, and we finally went back to the much maligned scavenger hunt format that is sometimes seen as almost passé in instruction. We thought, that's got some real things to recommend it. It's very concrete, it's tactile, it's goal-oriented, so addresses some of these issues that we talked about before about multisensory approaches and being hands-on, not being overly difficult or abstract. So we went with that. We were actually also inspired by our particular book, getting back to issues of collection development. This was one of our successes with Leah's book club, Escape from Mr. Lemoncello's Library, which you might be familiar with. So it has to do with a sort of team building escape format where children are locked in this futuristic library and they're divided into teams. They each have a goal of breaking out of the library using different clues and ultimately the library resources. So we were surprised that the students loved this. Especially since some of the content and some of the puzzles to figure this out were pretty advanced stuff and not the kind of thing we expected them to follow, but either they did or else just the basic narrative kind of competitive theme of the book overrode that and allowed them to follow it. But it was a big success, and we thought, well, why don't we turn this on its head? Instead of having the students escape from the library, we have them go into the library and trying to use it, and this kind of connects with our scavenger hunt theme. So that's basically how we designed it. The specifics are, we said, okay, we want you to use the discovery system, find some book of interest and its call number, go ahead and go out into the stacks, search for and retrieve the book, and then bring it back to show us kind of proof of life, and then check it out. So we divide the students into teams of 3, again, so they could reinforce each other. To each find and report on one book per team. And then as they went out into the stacks, we had adult supervisors with them to assist them along the way and also to provide kind of an assessment mechanism to see how they were doing and report on that. So that's where we are now at our program. We have the two activities, the orientation, the book search, and I'll talk about the results by way of our assessment mechanism. So with the assessment, we concluded our tour with a quiz on PowerPoint, just highlighting points that we covered about how many books we have in the library, how long can you check them out for, what do you need to check them out, how many floors, reasonable questions that would summarize the content. And our result was collective success. So working as a team, they got all the questions correct. For the book search, our assessment took a slightly different form. Fundamentally, actually, our second to last point here on this list, could they find the book and the call number? Yeah, that was easily done just by observing. The harder part was navigating the map that we gave them and then navigating the call number sequence in the shelves. So that proved to be difficult, going from the folding map to the physical building, which in our case is pretty confusing anyway, and then the shelves where they went up and down and left to right and how the letters and number sequences went. This proved difficult, but it was all doable and something they could move forward with. And I'll also mention, as a result of that experience, we're actually working on a project here at our library for indoor mapping, which is an adaptation of the GPS programming for cars to our individual building, where they can pull up a mobile phone and see a pathway in GPS. So that's kind of a new project that's actually come out of this that will hopefully address this and maybe even help the rest of our patrons. Okay, so an irony in all this is curriculum scaffolding. So as long as I've been a librarian for the last 20 years, we've been kind of stuck on the one-shot library session where we can't seem to get beyond that. And we have these dreams of, well, developing a whole sequence of library sessions that match the progress of students as they go through their classes. But that hasn't materialized in most cases, but it actually may for our students with ID who we are just being introduced to the library. But due to the success we've had so far and our good relationship with the program, they said, go ahead, have any kind of library session you want. So here is our program that we're envisioning. So we've got the orientation and the book searching down. What's coming next this quarter will be online article searching, team and individual. We're also doing some embedded librarianship where I go mingle with the students in their activities and work on them with different questions that arise. Okay, and then here are future visions, citation management. So when they find online materials, where does it go? Maybe they can use a citation manager or some kind of storage system online. How about interlibrary loan for other, and we're already working on this in connection with the embedded librarianship where we don't actually have certain fictional books the students request, so we're going outside. Maybe they can start to evaluate the sources of what they find. One of my colleagues even suggested video production where they make videos. Okay, it's all possible. So this is a draft of our curriculum scaffolding that we're hoping to put up. Okay, so these are all the nuts and bolts of what we've done, but as to principles of what make it work, I'm actually going back to this kind of esoteric source. Sun Tzu is a semi-legendary figure in ancient Chinese history who wrote a book called The Art of War, which has persisted and is still considered kind of a classic of military strategy. So it's very aphoristic with these kind of individual sayings that you're supposed to interpret, but one that is relevant here is this point: the battle is won before it is fought. Which is very unintuitive. One would think, well, you win a battle by fighting it. So how do you win it before it's fought? It doesn't seem to make sense. But his idea is that, well, you actually want to prepare everything beforehand without leaving anything to chance. So we're not talking about wars here. We're talking about challenges. So my application of this is, how do we prepare in advance to make sure our activities are successful instead of just leaving it up to chance? So our formula is it really depends on relationship building. So we did the orientation right away, but I thought, we're not going to sail right into the book search until I find out more about what the students can do, what they're interested in. So I spent several months attending classes, becoming familiar with students so they recognize me, sharing personal interests with students. So we did some martial arts programming. We did team meditations, which is a mindfulness activity that's promoted by my colleague. We did yoga classes. So we kind of surrounded the students with support and familiarity. And then when it came time for the actual session, my colleague said, boy, you have a great rapport with them. And I said, yeah, that's no accident. We made it that way. So that, as much as the nuts and bolts of design are really what made this successful. And I think it's important to remember in designing a new program. Okay, also to be something to be aware of is the student's own interest. So this is just like our principle for book collection. Let the students choose their own book. Hopefully with this kind of introduction to library method, you'll see the students express their own interests and you want to take advantage of that. And some that I've had just interacting with our students here are requests for mystery books, romance books, especially something called the After series by an author named Anna Todd I wasn't familiar with. Okay, baseball, manga. A student helped me discover a small collection of manga in our library that I wasn't even aware of. Learning American Sign Language is a big interest of numbers of them, including learning Japanese. And then my favorite request, when I asked a student what she was interested in, she said, Einstein. I want to learn about Einstein. Okay. It turns out there's a great book called Einstein for Beginners. It's kind of a graphic novel presentation. So we've got that on loan from Interlibrary. We've got that order from Interlibrary Loan. So those are the kind of, that's the kind of self-interest I think that you look for and try to cultivate.
This is a review of how we assessed everything. We continue the life cycle of programming where we started with recruitment, and then we talked about theory and then the specific kinds of programming. Now we're going to review the assessment process of everything. So the first way to assess the success of a program, of course, is to look at the overall attendance. And then the second way to assess would be to keep record of who returns, so persistence, who continues to come back to subsequent sessions. This gives us some good data on persistence and how much the students are actually enjoying the program. The third type of assessment is through field observations, whether those are informal or formal. And of course, every teacher does this naturally. I mean, obvious markers of whether or not a student is engaged would be, are they participating? Are they paying attention? Are they listening? Are they staying on topic? Other obvious ways of noticing if one is disengaged, which I've actually had happen in club, is the student falling asleep? Are they not paying attention? Are they playing on their phone? Perhaps they are having side conversations. And then finally, I gave surveys to the students as well as their guardians. And this was a little bit challenging to survey students because their communication skills don't always, they're not quite honed. They do tend to have communication difficulties and they aren't always detailed in their responses. However, I found that they can be quite direct. And I think one of the funniest responses I received on one of the surveys was from Robin, who's pictured here on the slide. She did not enjoy the Mummy book that Marina liked so much. Her direct quote was, "I hate this book. It is boring and stupid. I cannot believe you made me read it, and I never want to read it again." And I just got the biggest chuckle out of that. I said, my God, you can't get much clearer than that. So assessment of traditional library activities is adapted to the types of activities that are done thus far. So after the orientation or physical tour that Matt was talking about, the students were shown a quiz on a PowerPoint with various multiple choice answers that were provided. And the questions were quite simple. They would ask, how many books are in the library, how many floors are in the building. And then the book search activity that Matt was discussing was analyzed through 3 metrics. The first was whether or not the students could work as a team initially or individually, which proved that they were a little bit more advanced. And then whether or not they were actually able to retrieve the book they were asked to find and then share it with their peers. And this was evaluated kind of on like a pass-fail scenario. And of course, Matt mentioned the adult supervisors were accompanying the students. They observed their behavior. They offered assistance as needed. And these observations gave sort of nuanced information about the students' capabilities. And they also fell under this famous educational theory of zone of proximal development, where students are really measured by what they can achieve with help rather than what or how they may fall short or fail. And then the last metric Matt discussed was observing the student interest. So if the students took the initiative to actually find a book or a title on a topic that they enjoy or were interested in pursuing, we consider this to be a great sign of teaching success. And we are conducting new research. We are currently undertaking a survey of the PSE programs and their interactions with libraries. We have approximately 300 PSE programs listed from the Think College site. And we are sending each of them emails with 4 questions that we ask about the types of interactions that they have with the various programs and their campus libraries. And our first question asks if there is an orientation or an instruction offered to the students. And these surveys are directed to the PAC directors. And then if there's no interaction, we follow up with the campus librarians. And we are also following up with the libraries, whether or not there's interactions between their programs and the libraries as well. So first, we focused on 20 programs of the 300 that were winners of competitive grants. So we sort of viewed them as being model programs overall. We contacted all 20 and received a total of 8 responses. And of the 8, 6 reported that yes, they do have, and they have had initial conversations and communications to include holding orientations as well as instructions. But none of the librarians from the 6 campuses responded with actual details of what they did.
Okay, so those initial 20 were kind of a microcosm we were directed to first by Think College, saying, well, these are the 20 most likely to respond. There are models, and we got about half takers, and some subset of those, maybe a third, were actually actively connecting with their libraries. So we've gone beyond to try to survey the whole field of 300, which is taking a little while, but to date, we're up to about 100 contacted, of which we have maybe a 20% response rate that are distributed as follows. So most of them have some kind of communication, orientation, instruction. Those instructions are sorted out into the categories you see. The students are given a presentation. They are just integrated with the normative students on campus, or an individual librarian is assigned to them. So one can interpret this favorably as saying, well, this actually mirrors the mainstreaming of students in the educational system, where they are integrated with others, and where there's, individual questions, they are separated out for sort of individual consultation. So that's the theory of special education, how it works. Maybe more critically, we could say, well, it looks like we're maybe avoiding the question of a specialized tailored presentation. We're kind of lumping them together with the other students. So this is something that needs to be interpreted. And as I said, we're in the process of gathering information. We will continue to send out a request and develop our survey. Okay, our large conclusion so far is that there's no response. Probably there isn't a lot going on. So we're guessing on the order of maybe 20% of the libraries have some kind of relation to their PSE programs, which is a little bit discouraging, since the recruitment has actually been solved. I mean, there are the students in proximity and nothing's been happening. So that's something that's kind of unfortunate. In any case, our goal with our study is to try to show best practices among these librarians and see what's possible. So again, that's something that's in progress, and hopefully we'll have some concrete results to publicize by the summer is our timeline. Okay, another type of involvement is not just serving the students with reference and instruction, but actually employing them within the library. So I know we broached this at one of our talks, and the response from the librarians was, well, we don't really do that. And my thought was, well, I didn't think I did either, but it's very useful. There actually are some libraries out there who do that. This is an ideal fit, an ideal sort of connection libraries can make. These jobs are very congenial. They are low stress. They're tolerant. There's a variety of jobs. There are precedents. Actually, Leah's program began with exploring internship possibilities. And then, as I pointed out with our library, there's kind of a double effect, a speaking picture, in that our students who are working for us, can provide actual service to patrons. And also in the process of doing that, they're demonstrating just by their work, the whole principle of diversity and how those with intellectual disability can contribute to the community. So there's a kind of double benefit of employment, both for the students and also for libraries in their mission of diversity. Okay, so these are details on training costs. It turns out California actually pays for trainers for students. That was defrayed in our case. I don't know if that's true of other states, but it's something to investigate. Okay, and these are just some points that I covered about the value of employment.
So we do have a vision of what the future is going to be, and this involves a look at the past through a very unusual person by the name of Miss Maddie Riles. Miss Maddie is wonderful. Over the course of our research, we were introduced to her. We had the wonderful opportunity to meet Miss Maddie, interview Miss Maddie. She is the oldest practitioner of creating the first program for adults with ID before anyone else. She runs a Wednesday Friends program out of Macomb, Mississippi. We still stay in touch with Miss Maddie, and she gives us updates about what the adults are doing. And the location of her program is quite interesting, because as you remember from some of our previous GIS graphs that we showed in our previous presentation, there was a large amount of programming located in the southeastern part of the US, and we couldn't quite figure out why, given that this typically is not an area that supports such programming. And the actual location of Miss Maddie's program is in a very small, rural, southern country town called Macomb in southeast Mississippi. And interestingly enough, this was the site of significant violence during the civil rights movement of the 60s. And this really isn't where you would think a lot of innovation or forward thinking would occur. So a little bit of background, Miss Maddie, she began as a children's librarian, and then she told us the story of a young girl by the name of Bobo who had intellectual disabilities. And every morning, Bobo would stand by the fence and she'd watch her brothers and sisters leave for school. And she would rock back and forth very sadly and say, school, school, school. And Miss Maddie was so moved by this that she created her own program based on her own initiative. And this program actually began in the 70s. And as I said, it's still running very, very strong today. It's very vibrant. It's housed within the public library of Macomb. And every week they do a variety of activities. They have a long list of guest speakers to include, they've actually had a Maasai warrior come speak to them from Africa. Matt mentioned the pageant winner, Miss Mississippi, came and talked to the group about what it's like to be a beauty pageant contender. So the future isn't just about the duration of how long this program has lasted, but it's really more about the total community integration. And just to give an example of how involved Miss Maddie is and how much the community loves her, the women of the Junior League are actively involved in fundraising, as are the local firefighters who every Saturday host a pancake breakfast for the adults with disability. And so this is an example of total community integration. So Miss Maddie began this Wednesday Friends program in the 1970s. It is still running strong today. She is turning 90 in May. She is sharp as a tack, very alert, and the community loves Miss Maddie. And I have a funny story that I do want to share. When Matt and I visited Miss Maddie and her assistant Laura Stokes, Miss Maddie took us out to the local dinner bell. And it actually happened to be when the nearby meat packing plant was on break for their lunch. And we walk in and there's this room of all these young men who worked at the nearby packing plant. And in unison, it was almost like it was planned, but I know it wasn't. They saw Miss Maddie and they said, "Hey, Miss Maddie." And she said, "Hi, y'all, sugar." And I just thought to myself, this is so lovely. Everywhere she walks, someone greets her with such warmth and affection. And that just kind of shows the type of person she is. So she created this program. She keeps it going. They kept it going even during the pandemic. The adults are back. They do crafts. They do singing. They have the guest speakers that I mentioned. They have pizza parties. And it really is such an excellent example of total community integration where everyone is involved in making it the success that it is. And I think that's due to the fact that they love Miss Maddie so much.
These are some thoughts from intellectual visionaries that we don't really have time to go into detail about, so I'll just leave this for your consideration with the slide deck. So let's go to the next one, Leah, another one, and then the next one. So resources, so you're very welcome to contact Leah and I in future about anything connected to this subject. We're glad to talk about it. These are book reviews of our book if you want a sample, and you're certainly also welcome to go ahead and look at the original copy. Okay, another resource by Nicola Grove herself about her work in multisensory literature. We've also put her email down at the bottom. She's just an extremely congenial person who actually wrote one of our book reviews and then reached out to us. And we've had some interesting collaborations with her. So she would be very happy to respond to any inquiries, and you're welcome to go ahead and contact her. Okay, so that concludes. So again, sorry for butting up so closely to the end, but we wanted to include everything. And I hope for anything extra, you certainly feel free to review our PowerPoint and certainly to contact us with any questions. Thank you. Thank you, Mary, and everyone. Thank you again.
Take care.